Yakety yak, guess who's back? Welcome back to Free Read Fridays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fraggeth. Today, I'm going to figure out why my microphone is so quiet. There we go, that's better. Okay, so today's cover art is fan art, because I am low on cover art, by Eric Hay from 2016. And Peter Watts has this to say. A minimalist, weirdly evocative sketch of an alien Lenie and her spirit echinoderm. Because, back in previous, the book Starfish, she had like a thing with starfish. You know, yeah. Anyway,
Sort of the titular critter from, the book. It's the whole thing. You had to be there, I guess.
anyway, so previously on, rest in peace, Mandlebrot. Mandlebrot bit the big one. We don't quite know how that went down. We will learn. There were illusions. And so Achilles reacts accordingly and, burns and mutilates to death the family of the vet that he called, who said, human civilization is holding on by its absolute fingertips, right? I'm not gonna save your cat because people are more important. And Achilles said, okay. Shame about your wife and kids, though. And, burned them all to death horribly. Because Achilles is not a nice man. He just isn't. He's just not very nice. Um, so he's doing great. He was almost happy, elated that he actually felt anything at Mandlebrot's death, which means he's not a traditional psychopath or sociopath, as the case may be. He's got a bit more going on, possibly, which is interesting. At any rate, oh yeah, and Lenie and what's her name, Taka Willette, are trying to get people to find samples of what's being airdropped from other countries using missiles. So they've kind of low-key sent out the word, not so low-key, sent out the word, and people are going to look for the stuff, whatever it may be. And Ken has finally rejoined them. He was unable to get into Portland, Maine, because it's kind of been turned into a clave. It's walled off, lots of security. He can't realistically get in unnoticed, which is, kind of his shtick. At any rate, that is about it for previously ons. And I guess with that, we'll get cracking. Just give me a sec to drink up here, influidate, and we'll get rolling. Yowza, that's tangy. Jeez. I didn't want to put too much sugar into the homemade lemonade I went with, but man, maybe I could have done a little more than that. It was actually a lemon limeade. I had some lime juice floating around, and some lemonade I wanted to make, and then then I was like, oh, just put it in there. Well, maybe I should have thought twice. I don't know. Tangy. Yow. Almost enough to bring tears to one's eyes. Okay. So, yeah. Let's get walking. Let's get crocking. Sleeper. Everything changed at 10:30 the next morning. The bike skidded into view just past Bow, and promptly got into an argument with its rider over how best to deal with a pothole the size of Arkansas. It was a late model Kawasaki from just before the Witch, and it had ground effect stabilizers that made it virtually untippable. Otherwise, both man and machine would have gone end over end into a solar-powered billboard that, even after all these years, flickered with dead celebrity endorsements for Johnson & Johnson immune boosters. Instead, the Kawasaki leaned sideways at some impossibly acute angle, righted itself en route, and slewed to a stop between Miri and a handful of feral children looking for freebies. Ken's white eyes appeared in the shadowy darkness of the gap in The Gap, behind the newcomer. The gap being the first gap being The Gap, and then the second gap being The Gap, the corporate entity. Former corporate entity. They likely don't exist anymore in this particular timeline setting. The rider was all limbs and scraps, topped by a ragged thatch of butchered brown hair. Barely visible against a backdrop of grimy skin, a sparse mustache said maybe 16.
You the doctor with the missiles?
I'm the doctor who's interested in the missiles, Taka told him.
I'm Ricketts. Here.
He reached under a threadbare thermochrome jacket and hauled out a Ziploc bag with some very dirty laundry wadded up inside. Taka took the bag between thumb and forefinger. What's this? Ricketts ticked off a list on his fingers.
Gouchies, a shirt, and one sock. They had to, improvise. I had the only bag, and I was way over on another run.
Laurie climbed out of the cab. Tuck?
Hello,
Ricketts said. His mouth split in an appreciative grin. One tooth chipped, two missing, the rest in 4 shades of yellow. His eyes ran down Lenny like a barcoder. Not that Taka could blame him. Out here, anyone with clear skin and all their teeth qualified as a sex symbol almost by default. She snapped her fingers to get him back to the real world. What is this, exactly?
Right.
Ricketts came back to point.
Weg and Morricone found one of these canister thingies you put the word out about. It was leaking this shit all over. Not like rivers of the stuff, just like sweating it almost. So they soaked it up in that.
A gesture at the bag.
And handed it off to me. I've been driving all night.
Where's this from? Taka asked.
You mean where we found it? Burlington.
It was almost too good to be true.
That's in Vermont,
he added helpfully. Ken was suddenly at Ricketts' shoulder. There was a missile drop on Vermont, he said. The boy turned, startled, saw Ken, saw the eyes.
Nice caps, he said approvingly. I was into rifters myself back before,
Rifters, Taka remembered. They'd run geothermal stations way off the west coast. The missiles, Ken said. Do you remember how many there were?
Dunno, like maybe 4 or 5 that I saw, but.
Were there lifters? Was there a burn?
Yeah, someone said there might be. That was why we all scrambled.
But was there?
I don't know. I didn't hang around. You guys wanted this stuff fast, right?
Yes. Yes. Taka looked at the fouled, greasy wad in the bag. It was the most beautiful sight she'd ever seen. Ricketts, thank you. You have no idea how important this could be.
Yeah, well, if you really want to be grateful, how about a charge off your rig?
He slapped the bike between his thighs.
This thing's down to the moho. I got maybe another 10 clicks and. Or, hey, is there maybe some kind of reward?
The reward, Taka thought, unlocking the umbilical for Ricketts' bike, is that all of us might not be dead in 10 years. She fed the treasure into the sample port with tender reverence, let Miri slice away the packaging and squeeze the gold from the dross. And there was gold, evident as much in what wasn't there as in what was. Behemoth was far below the usual baseline in this sample, almost negligible. Something's killing the witch. That initial explanation, that validation of a belief already grown from hope to near certainty over the past weeks, threatened to squash all the scientific empiricism Taka's training had instilled in her. She forced caution onto her excitement. She would run the tests. She would do the legwork. But some squealing inner undergrad knew it would only confirm what she already knew, what this first glorious result suggested. Something was killing the witch. And there it was. Mixed in with the molds and the fungi and the fecal coliform, it glimmered like a string of pearls half buried in mud, a genetic sequence that Miri's database didn't recognize. She brought it up and blinked. That can't be right. She whistled through her teeth. What? Laurie asked at her elbow. This is going to take longer than I thought, Taka said. Why? Because I've never seen anything like this before. Maybe we have, Ken said. I don't think so. Not unless you've... Taka stopped. Miri was flashing an interface alert at her, someone asking for download access. She nodded at Ken. Is that you? He nodded. It's the sequence for a new bug we encountered recently. Encountered where? Nowhere local, an isolated area. What, a lab? A mountaintop? The Mariana Trench? Ken didn't answer. His data knocked patiently at Miri's front door. Finally, Taka let it in. You think this is the same thing? She asked as the system filtered it for nasties. It's possible. You had it all the while, and this is the first time you've shown it to me. This is the first time you had anything to compare it with. Sweet smoking Jesus, Ken, you're not much of a team player, are you? At least it answered one question. Now she knew why these two had hung around for so long. It's not a counteragent, Laurie said, as if to gird her against inevitable disappointment. Taka called up the new sequence. So I see. She shook her head. It's not our mystery bug either. Really? Laurie looked surprised. You can tell that after 5 seconds? It looks like Behemoth. It's not, Ken assured her. Maybe a new strain, then. I'd have to grind through the whole sequence to be sure, but I can tell but just by looking that it's an RNA bug. The biosol isn't? I don't know what it is. It's a nucleic acid of some kind, but the sugar's got a 4-carbon ring. I've never seen it before, and it doesn't seem to be in any of Miri's cheat sheets. I'm going to have to take it from scratch. A look passed between Ken and Laurie. It spoke volumes, but not to her. Don't let us stop you, Ken said. Oh, thanks for tuning in, Kiri. I appreciate it. Glad you're enjoying. Mary could identify known diseases and cure those for which cures had been found. It could generate random variants of the usual targeted antibiotics and prescribe regimens that might keep ahead of your average bug's ability to evolve countermeasures. It could fix broken bones, excise tumors, and heal all manner of physical trauma. When it came to Behemoth, it was little more than a palliative center on wheels, of course, but even that was better than nothing. All in all, the MI was a miracle of modern medical technology. But it was a field hospital, not a research lab. It could sequence novel genomes, as long as the template was familiar, but that wasn't what it had been built for. Genomes built on unfamiliar templates were another thing entirely. This bug wasn't DNA or RNA, not even the primitive, barely helical variant of RNA that Behemoth hung its hat on. It was something else altogether, and Miri's database had never been designed to deal with anything like it. Taka didn't give a damn. She made it do that anyway. She found the template easily enough once she looked beyond the nuts and bolts sequencing routines. It was right there in a dusty corner of the Biomed Encyclopedia. TNA. A threose-based nucleic acid first synthesized back at the turn of the century. The usual bases attached to a threose. Yes, we're going with that. With a threose sugar phosphate backbone with phosphodiester bond. Oh my god. Thanks, Watts. Man's dropping big words on me. All these multisyllabic hoo-has up in here. The usual bases attached to a threose sugar phosphate backbone with phosphodiester bonds connecting the nucleotides. I'm pretty sure I've mispronounced everything there, but we're going to roll with it for now. Some early theoretical work had suggested it might have played a vital role back when life was still getting started, but everyone had pretty much forgotten about it after the Martian panspermians won the day. A novel template meant novel genes. The standard reference database was virtually useless. Decoding the new sequence with the tools in Miri's arsenal was like digging a tunnel with a teaspoon. You could do it, but you had to be really motivated. Fortunately, Taka had motivation up to here. She dug in, knowing it would just take time and maybe a few unavoidable detours down blind alleys. Too much time. Way too many detours. And what bugged Taka was, she knew the answer already. She'd known almost before she'd started. Every painstaking, laborious, mind-numbing test supported it. Every electrophoretic bleh. I was so close. Every electrophoretic band, every virtual blot, every PCR and TTD, all these haphazard techniques stapled together hour after bloody hour, they all pointed, glacially, implacably, to the same glorious answer. And it was a glorious answer. So after 3 days, tired of the endless triple checks and replicates, she decided to just go with what she had. She presented her findings near midday back at the cove, for privacy and the convenience of a ready charge. It's not just a tweak job, she told the rifters. A lone bedraggled gull picked its way among the stones. It's a totally artificial organism designed from scratch. And it was designed to outcompete Behemoth on its own turf. It's got a TNA template, which is fairly primitive, but it also uses small RNAs in a way that Behemoth never did. That's an advanced trait, a eukaryotic trait. It uses proline for catalysis, a single amino acid doing the job of a whole enzyme. Do you have any idea how much space that saves? No, they didn't. The blank looks made that more than obvious. She cut to the chase. The bottom line, my friends, is if you throw this little guy into culture with Behemoth, it'll come out the winner every time. In culture, Ken repeated. No reason to think it won't do the same in the wild. Remember, it was designed to make its own way in the world. The plan was obviously just to dump it into the system as an aerosol and leave it to its own devices. Ken grunted, scrolling through Taka's results on the main display. What's this? What? Oh, yeah, it's a polyploid. Polyploid? Lori repeated. You know, haploid, diploid, polyploid, multiple sets of genes. You mostly see it in some plants. Why here? Ken wondered.
I found some nasty recessives, Taka admitted. Maybe they were deliberately inserted because of some positive effect they'd have in concert with other genes, or maybe it was a rush job, so they just slipped through. As far as I can tell, the redundant genes were just layered on to eliminate any chance of homozygous expression. He grunted. Not very elegant. Taka shook her head, impatient. Certainly it's a ham-fisted solution, but it's quick and... I mean, the point is, it works. We could beat Behemoth.
If you're right, Ken mused. It's not Behemoth you have to beat.
The M&Ms, Taka suggested.
Something changed in Laurie's stance. Ken looked unconvinced. Possibly, although the counter-strikes appear to originate with the North American Defense Shield.
Xira, Laurie said quietly.
Ken shrugged. At this point, CSIRA effectively is the armed forces on this continent, and there don't appear to be much in the way of centralized governments left to keep it in check.
Shouldn't matter, Taka said. Lawbreakers are incorruptible.
Maybe they were before Rio. Now, who knows?
No.
Taka saw scorched landscapes. She remembered lifters on the horizon, breathing fire.
We take our orders from them. We all...
Then it's probably just as well you kept this project so close to your chest, Lubin remarked.
But why would anyone...
Laura was looking from Taka to Ken, disbelief written across her face.
I mean, what would be in it for them? More than confusion, Taka realized. Loss, too. Anguish.
Something clicked at the back of her mind. Laurie hadn't really believed it all this time. She had helped where she could. She had cared. She had accepted Taka's interpretation of events, at least as a possibility, because it had offered her an opportunity to help set things right. And yet, only now did she seem to realize that what the interpretation entailed. The large-scale implications of what it was they were fighting. Not Behemoth after all, but their own kind.
Odd, Taka reflected, how often it comes down to that.
It wasn't just the end of the world, not to Laurie. It seemed somehow more intimate than that. It was almost as if someone had betrayed her personally.
Welcome back,
Taka thought to the vulnerable creature peeking again, at long last, from behind the mask.
I've missed you. I don't know, she said at last. I don't know who would do this or why, but the point is, now we stop it. Now we culture these babies and we send them out to do battle. Taka pulled up the stats on her incubators. I've already got 5 liters of the stuff ready to go, and I'll have 20 by morn. That's odd, she thought, as a little flashing icon caught her eye for the first time. That looks like... The bottom dropped out of her stomach. Oh, shit, she whispered.
What?
Ken and Laurie leaned in as one. My lab's online. She stabbed at the icon. It blinked back at her, placidly unresponsive. My lab's online. It's uploading. God knows what it's... In an instant, Ken was scrambling up the side of the van.
Get the toolkit, he snapped, sliding across the roof toward a little satellite dish, rising somehow from its recessed lair, pointing at the sky.
What?
Laurie dove into the cab. Ken yanked against the dish, breaking its fixation on some malign geosynchronous star. Suddenly he cried out and thrashed, stopped himself just short of rolling off the roof. His back was arched, his hands and head lifted away from the metal. The dish stuttered back toward alignment, stripped gears whining. Fuck! Laurie tumbled out onto the pavement. The toolkit spilled its guts beside her. She scrambled to her feet, yelled, Shut it down, for Christ's sakes! The hull's electrified! Taka stumbled toward the open door. She could see Ken wriggling back toward the dish on his back and elbows, using his dive skin as insulation. As she ducked her head to hop past the trim, thank God we disarmed the internals, a familiar hum started up deep in Miri's guts. The weapons blister, deploying. GPS was online. She killed it. It resurrected. All external defenses were awake and hungry. She called them off. They ignored her. Outside, Ken and Lori shouted back and forth. What do I do? What? She scrambled under the dash and pulled open the fuse box. The circuit breakers were clunky, manual things, unreachable to any demon built of electrons. She pulled the plugs on security and comm and GPS. She yanked autopilot, too, just in case. A chorus of electrical hums fell instantly silent around her. Taka closed her eyes for a moment and allowed herself a deep breath. Voices drifted through the open door as she pulled herself back up into the driver's seat. You okay? Yeah, skin took most of the charge. She knew what had happened. What happened again, she corrected herself, grabbing the headset from its hook. She was no coder. She barely knew how to grow basic programs. But she was a competent medical doctor, at least, and even bottom-half graduates knew their tools. Even bottom-half graduates knew their tools. She'd spared the med systems from disconnection. Now she brought up an architectural schematic and ran a count of the modules. There were black boxes in there. One of them, according to the icon, even had a direct user interface. She tapped it. The Madonna hung in front of her, not speaking. Its teeth were bared, a smile of some kind, full of hate and triumph. Some distant, unimportant part of Taka Willet's mind wondered at what possible selective advantage an app could accrue by presenting itself in this way. Did intimidation in the real world somehow increase fitness in the virtual one? But a much bigger part of Taka's mind was occupied with something else entirely, something that had never really sunk in before. This avatar had capped eyes. They all did. Every Lenie she'd ever encountered. The faces changed from demon to demon, different lips, different cheeks and noses, different ethnicities, but always centered on eyes white and featureless as snowdrifts. My name's Taka Willet, she had said an eternity ago. And this strange cipher of a woman, who seemed to take the apocalypse so personally, had replied, Lori. Taka. Taka started, but no, the Lenie wasn't talking to her. This Lenie wasn't. She slipped off the iPhones. A woman in black with machinery in her chest and eyes like little glaciers looked in at her. She didn't look anything like the creature in the wires. No rage, no hate, no triumph. Somehow it was this expressionless, flesh and blood face that she would have associated with machinery. It was a Madonna, Taka said, inside the med system. I don't know how long it's been in there. We have to go, Lori said. It was hiding in there, spying, I guess. Taka shook her head. I didn't even know they could run silent like that. I thought they always just automatically tore things apart every chance they got. It got a signal out. We've got to go before the lifters get here. Right. Focus, Tak. Worry about this later. Ken was at Lori's shoulder. You said you had 5 liters in culture. We'll take some with us. You disperse the rest. Drive into town, ring your siren, and give at least a few mils to anybody who qualifies, and get out. We'll catch up with you later if we can. You have the list? Taka nodded. There are only 6 locals with wheels. 7 if Ricketts is still around. Don't give it to anyone else, Ken said. People on foot aren't likely to get out of the burn zone in time. I'd also advise you to avoid mentioning the lifters to anyone who doesn't have an immediate need to know.
Forget it. Everyone deserves a heads up at least. They can't outrun the flamethrowers. If they can't outrun the flamethrowers, there are places to hide from them.
Ken sighed. Fine. Just so you know the risks you're taking. Saving a dozen lives here could doom a much greater number down the road.
Taka smiled, not entirely to herself. Weren't you the one who didn't think the greater number was worth saving in the first place? It's not that, Laurie said. He just likes the idea of people dying. Taka blinked, surprised. Two faces looked back at her. She could read nothing in either.
We have to hurry, Ken said. If they scramble from Montreal, we can only count on an hour.
The onboard lab could dispense product either fore or aft. Taka moved to the back of the MI and tapped instructions. Lenie?
Yeah, Laurie began, and suddenly fell silent.
No, Taka said quietly. I meant what about the Lenie?
The other woman said nothing.
Her face was as blank as a mask.
Ken broke the silence. Are you certain it can't get out again?
I physically cut power to nav, comm, and GPS, Taka said, not taking her eyes off the woman in front of her. I pretty much lobotomized the old girl.
Can it interfere with the culture process?
I wouldn't think so, not without being really obvious about it.
You're not certain.
Ken, right now I'm not certain about anything, although I'm approaching certainty about a thing or two.
It's living where? Reference and analytical?
Taka nodded. The only systems with enough room.
What happens if you shut them down?
The wet lab's on its own circuit. The cultures should be okay as long as we don't need to do any more heavy-duty analysis on them.
Pull the plug, Ken said.
A heat-sealed sample bag, half full of straw-colored liquid, slid from the dispensary and hung by its upper edge. Taka tore it free and handed it over. Keep the diffusion disk uncovered or the culture will suffocate. Other than that, they should be okay for about a week, depending on the temperature. Do you have a lab in your submarine? Basic med bay, Lenie said. Nothing like this.
We can improvise something, Lubin added. Can the diffuser handle seawater?
90 minutes, tops.
Okay, go.
Ken turned and started down the beach. Taka raised her voice. What if...
We'll catch up with you afterwards, he said, not turning.
I guess this is it then, Taka said. Lenie, still beside her, tried on a smile. It didn't fit. How will you find me? Taka asked her. I don't dare go online. Yeah, well... The other woman took a step toward the water. A swirl on that surface was all that remained of her partner. Ken's got a lot of tricks up his sleeve. He'll track you down. White eyes set into flesh and blood. White eyes sneering out from the circuitry of Miri's cortex. White eyes bringing fire and flood and any number of catastrophes down on the innocent, all across North America, all across the world, maybe. Both sets of eyes called Lenie. You... Taka began. Taka began. Lenie, the word made flesh, shook her head. Really, we've got to go. Parsimony.
Achilles Desjardins was breeding exorcists when he learned he was a suspect. It was a real balancing act. If you made the little bastards immutable, they wouldn't adapt. Even the vestigial wildlife hanging on in this pathetic corner of the net would chew them up and spit them out. But if you set the genes free, provoked mutation with too many random seeds, then how could you be sure your app would still be on mission a few generations down the road? Natural selection would weed out any pre-programmed imperatives the moment they came into conflict with sheer self-interest. Sometimes, if you didn't get the balance just right, your agent would forget all about its mission and join the other side. And the other side didn't need any more help. The Madonnas, or the Shredders, or the Goldfish, or any of the other whispered mythic names they'd acquired over the years, had already survived this gangrenous quagmire long past any reasonable expectation. Ah, they shouldn't have. They'd co-devolved to serve as little more than interfaces between the real world and the virtual one, mouthpieces for a superspecies assemblage that acted as a collective organism in its own right. By rights, they should have died in the crash that took out the rest of that collective, that took out 90% of all Maelstrom's wildlife. For how many faces make it onto their own? For how many faces make it on their own after the body behind is dead and gone? But they had defied that logic and survived. They had changed, been changed, into something more self-sufficient, something purer, something that even Desjardins' exorcists could barely match. They had been weaponized, the story went. There was no shortage of suspects. M&Ms and hobby terrorists and death cult hackers could all be releasing them into the system faster than natural selection took them out. And there was a limit to what anyone could do without a reliable physical infrastructure. The best troops in the world won't last a minute if you set them down in quicksand, and quicksand was all that Enem had to offer these days. A few hundred isolated fortresses hanging on by their fingernails, their inhabitants far too scared to go out and fix the fiber op. The decaying electronic habitat wasn't much better for wildlife than it was for human apps, but at 100 gens per sec, the wildlife still had the adaptive edge. Fortunately, Desjardins had a knack for exorcism. There were reasons for that, not all of them common knowledge, but the results were hard to argue with. Even those ineffectual and self-righteous jerk-offs hiding out on the other side of the world gave him that much. At least they all cheered him on, safe behind their barricades whenever he released a new batch of countermeasures. But as it turned out, they were saying other things as well. He wasn't privy to most of it. He wasn't supposed to be privy to any, but he was good enough to get the gist. He had his own hounds on the trail, prowling comsats, sniffing random packets, ever watchful for digital origami which might, when unscrambled and unfolded and pressed flat, contain the word Desjardins. Apparently, people thought he was losing his edge. He could live with that. Nobody racks up a perfect score against the death throes of an entire planet, and if he'd dropped a few more balls than normal over the past month, well, his failure rate was still way below the pack average. He outperformed any of those bozos who grumbled, however softly, during the teleconferences and debriefings and post-fiasco post-mortems that kept intruding on the war. They all knew it, too. He'd have to slip a lot further than this before anyone else in the patrol would be able to lay a hand on him. Still, there were hints of the wind changing at his back. Fragments of encrypted conversations between veterans in Helsinki and rookies in Melbourne, and middle management stats hounds in New Delhi. Disgruntled insistence from Weimers, King Sim himself, that there had to be some undiscovered variable wreaking havoc with his projections. And right this very second, a disembodied chunk of post-counterpoint snatched from the ether by one of Desjardins' minions. It was only a few seconds in length. Thanks to a filthy spectrum and the dynamic channel switching that coped with it, it was almost impossible to grab more without knowing which random seed to apply, but it seemed to have been connecting a couple of lawbreakers in London and McMurdo. It took 40 seconds and 6 nested Bayesians to turn it back into English.
Desjardins saved us from Rio,
Mr. McMurdo had opined moments earlier in a Hindian accent.
we'd have surely taken 10 times the losses had he not acted when he did. How those people threw off the trip?
Ms. London,
How do you know they did? How do you know they did?
Irish lilt. Enticing.
Well, let me see. They launched an unprovoked attack on a large number of. How do we know it was unprovoked? Of course it was unprovoked. Why? How do you know they didn't just see a threat to the greater good and try to stop it?
Precious moments of this fleeting excerpt wasted on astonished silence. Finally,
Are you suggesting that I'm saying history gets written by the victors? Rio's history. How do we know the good guys won?
end of excerpt. If McMurdo had had an answer, he hadn't got it out before the frequency skidded away. Wow, Desjardins thought. It was horseshit, of course. The idea that 21 separate CSIRA franchises could have simultaneously gone rogue was hardly more plausible than the thought that Rio alone had. Ms. London was a lawbreaker, not an idiot. She knew about parsimony. She'd just been blowing smoke out her ass, yanking poor old McMurdo's chain. Still, it gave Desjardins pause. He'd gotten used to being the man who stopped Rio. It put him above suspicion on so many counts. And it didn't sit well to think that there were people out there who could doubt his virtue, even for a moment. That could lead to second thoughts, he reflected. It could lead to closer looks. The board beeped again. For a moment he thought that he'd beaten all odds and reacquired the signal. But no. The new alert came from a different source entirely, a broadband dump from somewhere in Maine. That's odd, he thought. A Lenie had gotten into a medical database and was spewing random intelligence across half the EM spectrum. They did that a lot these days. Not content to merely scramble and hash, some had taken to shouting into the ether, indiscriminately dumping data into any network they could access. Some reproductive subroutine mutated to spread data instead of executables. At the very least, it threw more chaff into a system already losing usable bandwidth by the hour. At worst, it could blow the lid off of all sorts of secret and sensitive data. Either way, it was bad news for the real world. That would be enough to keep it going. This particular demon had uploaded a whole shitload of biomedical stuff from the database it had plundered. Desjardins' board had flagged it for potential epidemiological significance. He popped the lid and looked inside, and immediately forgot about any trivial bullshit gossip from London. There were 2 items, both rife with dangerous pathology. Desjardins was no pathologist, but then again he didn't have to be. The friends and advisors arrayed about him distilled all those biochemical details down to an executive summary that even he could understand. Now they served up a pair of genotypes with red flags attached. The first was almost Behemoth, only better. Greater resistance to osmotic stress, sharper teeth for cleaving molecules, higher virulence. At least one critical feature was the same, though. Like baseline Behemoth, this new strain was optimized for life at the bottom of the sea. It did not exist in the standard database, which raised the question of what its technical specs were doing in a glorified ambulance out of Bangor. It would have been enough to grab his attention even if it had arrived unaccompanied. It had brought a date, though, and she was the real ball breaker. She was the bitch he had always dreaded. She was the last thing he would have ever expected. Because he had always known that Seppuku would gain a foothold eventually. But he hadn't expected anyone on his own side to be culturing the damn thing. Corral. No, not coral.
There's two eyes. It's corral.
Taka cursed her own lack of foresight. They'd spread the word, all right. They'd told all who came by of their plan to save the world, the need for samples, the dangers of lingering afterward, the places she'd patrol to take charge of vital payloads. They'd taken special note of those few who'd driven up in cars or motorbikes or even plain old pedal-powered flywheels, got addresses from those who still had them, and told the rest to check back regularly. If all went well, they might save the world. And things had gone well, and then so horribly wrong in such quick succession. They had their counteragent, or some of it anyway, but no prearranged signals to bring in the couriers. And after all, why would they have even bothered? They could have taken an afternoon and driven around the country. They could have waited for those of no fixed address to check in tomorrow or the next day. And now Taka Willette had the salvation of the world in her hands, and some shrinking fraction of a 60-minute window to get it to safety. She ran the siren continuously from one end of Freeport to the other, a shrieking departure from the music employed to announce her day-to-day presence. Hopefully it would summon the healthy as well as the sick. She got some of both. She warned them all to take shelter. She promised a mother with a broken arm and a son with incipient stage 1 that she'd come back and help them when the fires had passed. She urged the others, as they fled, to send the six her way, or anyone else with wheels to burn. After 30 minutes, one of them came by. After 40, two more. She loaded them all with precious milliliters of amber fluid and sent them running. She begged them to send the others if they knew their whereabouts, if they could find them in time. 45 minutes, and nothing but a ragged handful of the hungry and the feeble. She chased them away with stories about fire-breathing dragons, sent them down to a fisherman's wharf that had once been the community's breadbasket. Now, if they were lucky, it might at least serve as a place from which to jump into the ocean. Surely the flames wouldn't scorch the whole Atlantic. 50 minutes. I can't wait. But there were others here, she knew. People she hadn't seen today. People she hadn't warned. And they're not coming, Tack. If you want to warn them, you might as well start going door to door. Search every house and hovel within 20 clicks. You've got 10 minutes. Ken had said they could count on 60 minutes. A minimum estimate, right? It might take longer. A lot longer. She knew what Dave would have said. She still had 2 liters of culture. Dave would have told her she could make all the difference. She could make all the difference if she didn't just sit there and wait for the furnace. It might not happen at all. What were they basing this on, anyway? A couple of firestorms that happened to follow aborted missile attacks? What about the times when the missiles fell and nothing happened afterward? There had to be times when nothing had happened. What about the times when the fires came, or the floods, or the explosions, with nothing to presage them? Correlation wasn't causation, and this wasn't even strong correlation. It convinced Ken. But she didn't know Ken at all. Didn't even know his last name, or Lenny's. She would have had nothing but their own word that they were who they said they were, if they had even bothered to really tell her even that much. And now even their names were suspect. Lori was not Lori at all, it seemed. Taka only had their word on the things they had said, her own speculation on all the things they hadn't, and the disturbing similarities between this amphibious woman and the demons in the net. 55 minutes. Go. You've done all you can here. Go. She started the engine. Committed, she didn't look back. She drove down the decaying asphalt as fast as she could without risking some pothole-induced rollover. Her fear seemed to increase in lockstep with her velocity, as though the diffuse and overgrown remains of Freeport and its pathetic half-starved inhabitants had somehow numbed her own instinct for self-preservation. Now, abandoning them, her heart rose in her mouth. She imagined the crackle of flames advancing along the road behind her. She fought the road. She fought panic.
You're going south, you idiot. We were south when the signal went out. South is where they'll start.
She screeched east onto Sherborne. Miri took the bend on two wheels. A shadow fell across the road before her. The sky darkened abruptly overhead. Her imagination saw great airships spewing fire. But her eyes, when she dared to look away from the road, saw only overarching trees, brownish-green blurs streaking the world on both sides, leaning over and blocking the afternoon sun. But no, that's the sun up ahead, setting. It was a great yellow-orange blob, dimmed by its slanting angle through the atmosphere. It was centered in the bright archway that marked the end of the tunnel of trees. It was setting directly over the road ahead.
How can it be so late? It can't be so late. It's only afternoon.
The sun was setting. The sun was setting the trees on fire. Sorry. The sun was setting. The sun was setting the trees on fire. There we go. Emphasis on the right syllable. She hit the brakes. The shoulder strap caught her around the chest, threw her back into the seat. The world grew ominously quiet. No more spitting clatter of rock against undercarriage, no more rattling of equipment on hooks, banging against Miri's walls. There was only the distant, unmistakable crackling of flame up from ahead. From up ahead, sorry. A containment perimeter. They'd started at the outside and moved in. She threw the MI into reverse and yanked hard on the stick. The vehicle skidded back and sideways, slewing into the ditch. Forward again, back the way she'd come. The tires spun in the soft, muddy embankment. A whooshing sound from overhead, like the explosive breath of a great whale she'd heard in the archives as a child. A sheet of flame flooded the road, blocking her escape. Heat radiated through the windshield.
Oh, Jesus! Oh, God!
She opened the door. Scorched air blasted her face. The seat belt held her fast. Panicky fingers took way too long to set her free, and then she was on the ground, rolling. She scrambled to her feet, bracing against Miri's side. The plastic burned her hands. A wall of flame writhed barely 10 meters away. Another, the one she'd mistaken for the setting sun, was farther off, maybe 60 meters on the other side of the MI. She sheltered on the cooler side of the vehicle. Better, but it wouldn't last.
Get the culture.
A mechanical groan, the bone-deep sound of twisting metal. She looked up. Directly overhead, through a mosaic of leaves and branches not yet burning, she saw the fractured silhouette of a great swollen disk wallowing in the sky.
Get the culture.
The road was blocked ahead and behind. Miri would never be able to push through the dying woodlands to either side, but Taka could run for it. Every instinct, every nerve was telling her to run for it.
The culture. Move!
She yanked open the passenger door and climbed over the seat. The icons blinking on the cab's rear wall seemed almost deliberately slow to respond. A little histogram appeared on the board. It rose as slowly as a tide. Whoosh! The forest across the road burst into flame. 3 sides gone now. 1 way left. 1 way.
Oh, Jesus!
The histogram blinked and vanished. The panel extruded a sample bag, swollen with culture. Taka grabbed it and ran. Whoosh! Flame ahead of her, pouring from the heavens like a liquid curtain. Flame on all sides now. Taka Willette stared into the firestorm for some endless, irrelevant span of seconds. Then she sank to the ground with a sigh. Her knees made indentations in the softening asphalt. The heat of the road burned her flesh. Her flesh was indifferent. She noted, vaguely surprised, that her face and hands were dry. The heat baked the sweat from her pores before it even had the chance to wet her skin. It was an interesting phenomenon. She wondered if anyone had ever written it up. It didn't really matter, though. Nothing did. Turncoat. That's odd, said Lenny Clark. The periscope had backed off from shore a ways to get a better northwest view over the trees. The image it conveyed was surprisingly bucolic. It was too far to see Freeport from here, and Freeport's dwellings and businesses had been spread far too widely to present anything approaching a skyline even in the old days. But they should have seen lifters, at least. They should have seen the flames or the smoke by now. "It's been 3 hours," Clark said, glancing across the cockpit. "Maybe you stopped the signal after all." "Or maybe," she mused, "we're completely off base about this whole thing." Lubin slid one finger a few millimeters along the panel. The scope's eye view panned left. "Maybe she made it," Clark remarked. Such dull, lifeless words for all the meaning they conveyed. "Maybe she saved the world. Maybe she saved me." "I don't think so," Lubin said. A pillar of smoke boiled up from behind the crest of a hill, staining the sky brown. She felt a tightness in her throat. "Where is that?" she asked. "Dead west," Lubin replied. They came ashore on the south side of the cove, a slope of smooth stones and gnarled driftwood growing slimy with behemoth. They followed the sun along a dirt road that had never seen so much as a signpost. The pillar of smoke led them on like a pole star with a half-life. With a half-life. I don't know why I'm losing my mind here. Thinning in the sky as they tracked it across paved roads and gravel ones, over the crest of a weathered bump called Snake Hill, judging by the name of the road that ran along its base. On into the setting sun itself. Moments into twilight, Lubin stopped, one hand raised in warning. By, by now, the once billowing column was all but exhausted, a few threads of smoke twisting into the sky. But they could see the source, a roughly rectangular patch of scorched woodland at the bottom of the hill. Or rather, a roughly rectangular outline. The center of the area appeared to be unburned. Lubin had his binocs out. "See anything?" Clark asked. He hummed. "Come on, Ken. What is it?" He handed her the binoculars without a word. There was a disquieting moment when the device tightened itself around her head. Suddenly the world was huge and in sharp focus. Clark felt brief vertigo and stepped forward, bracing against sudden illusory imbalance. Twigs and blighted leaves the size of dinner tables swept past in a blur. She zoomed back to get her bearings. Better. There was the scorched earth, there was the patch in its midst, and there was... "Oh, shit," she murmured. Miri sat dead center of the clear zone. It looked undamaged. Willette stood beside it. She appeared to be conversing with a gunmetal ovoid half her size, hovering a meter over her head. Its carapace was featureless. Its plastron bristled with sensors and antennae. A botfly. Not so long ago, teleoperated robots just like it had hounded Lenny Clark across a whole continent. "Busted," Lubin said. The world was bleaching in Clark's eye caps by the time they reached the MI. Willette sat on the road with her back against the van, legs bent, arms crossed loosely over knees, staring listlessly at the pavement between her feet. She looked up at the sound of their approach. The botfly hung overhead like a bodyguard. It showed no visible reaction to their arrival. Bleached light wasn't enough to account for the pallor of Willette's face. She looked absolutely bloodless. There were wet streaks on her face. She looked at Clark and shook her head. "What are you?" she said. Her voice was as empty as a cave. Clark's throat went dry. "You're not just some refugee. You're not just some rifter who's been hiding for 5 years. You you started this somehow. You started it all."
Clark tried to swallow, looked to Lubin. But Lubin's eyes didn't waver from the botfly. She spread her hands.
"Tak, the monsters in the machines, they're all you."
Willette seemed stunned at the sheer magnitude of Clark's betrayal.
"The M&Ms and the fanatics and the death cults, they're all following you." "They're not," Clark wanted to shout. "I'd stop them all in a second if I could. I don't know how any of it got started."
But that would be a lie, of course. Maybe she hadn't formally founded the movements that had sprung up in her wake, but that didn't make them any less faithful to the thing she'd been. They were the very essence of the rage and hatred that had driven her, the utter indifference to any loss but her own. They hadn't done it for her, of course. The seething millions had their own reasons for anger, vendettas far more righteous than the false pretenses on which Lenny Clark had waged war. But she had shown them the way. She had proven it was possible. And with every drop of her blood that she spilled, every precious inoculation of Behemoth into the world, she had given them their weapons. Now there was nothing she could bring herself to say. She could only shake her head and force herself to meet the eyes of this accuser and one-time friend.
"And now they've really outdone themselves,"
Willette continued in her broken, empty voice.
"Now they've—"
She took a breath.
"Oh God," she finished. "I fucked up so bad."
Like a marionette, she pulled herself to her feet. Still, the botfly didn't move.
"It wasn't a counteragent,"
Willette said. This time, Lubin spared a glance. "What do you mean?"
"I guess we're not dying fast enough. The witch was beating us, but we were slowing it down at least. We lost 4 people for every one we saved, but at least we were saving some. But the M&Ms don't get into paradise until we're all dead, so they came up with something better."
"And they are?" Lubin asked, turning back to the teleop.
"Don't look at me," the machine said quietly. "I'm one of the good guys."
Clark recognized the voice in an instant. So did Lubin. "Desjardins."
"Ken, old buddy."
The botfly bobbed a few centimeters in salute.
"Glad you remember me."
"You're alive," Clark thought. "After Rio, after Sudbury going dark, after 5 years, you're alive. You're alive after all, my friend." Willette watched the proceedings with numb amazement on her face.
"You know—"
He helped us out," Clark told her, "a long time ago." "We thought you were dead," Lubin said.
"Likewise. It's been pretty much 7 seconds to sockeye ever since Rio, and the only times I had a chance to ping you, you'd gone dark. I figured you'd been done in by some disgruntled faction who never made the cut. Still, here you are."
"My friend," Clark thought again. He'd been that when even Ken Lubin had been trying to kill her. He'd risked his life for her before they'd even met. By that measure, although their paths had only crossed briefly, he was the best friend she'd ever had. She had grieved at the word of his death. By rights, now she should be overjoyed. But one word looped endlessly through her mind, subverting joy with apprehension. Spartacus.
"So," she said carefully, "you're still a lawbreaker?"
"Fighting entropy for the greater good," the botfly recited. "And that includes burning thousands of hectares down to the bedrock?" Lubin queried. The botfly descended to Lubin eye level and stared lens to lens.
If killing 10 saves 1,000, it's a deal, Ken, and nobody knows that better than you. Maybe you didn't hear what our lovely friend just told you, but there's a war on."
The bad guys keep lobbing seppuku into my court, and I've been doing my damnedest to keep it from getting a foothold. I've got barely any staff, and the infrastructure's falling apart around my ears, but I was managing, Ken, I really was. And then, as I understand it, you two walked into poor Taka's life, and now at least 3 vectors have snuck past the barricades.
Lubin turned to Willette. Is this true?
She nodded. I checked it myself when he told me what to look for. It was subtle, but it was right there. Chaperone proteins and alternative splicing, RNA interference. A bunch of second and third order effects I never saw. They were all tangled up in the polyploid genes, and I just didn't look hard enough. It gets inside you. It kills Behemoth, sure enough, but then it just keeps going, and I didn't see it. I was so sure I knew what it was, and I just fucked up.
She stared at the ground, away from accusing eyes.
I fucked up again, she whispered.
Lubin said nothing for a few seconds. Then, to the fly, you understand that there are reasons for caution here.
You don't trust me? Desjardins sounded almost amused. I'm not the one with the compulsive murder fetish, Ken. And I'm not the only one who shook off the trip. Are you really in a position to throw stones?
Willette looked up, startled from her bout of self-loathing.
And whatever misgivings you have, the lawbreaker continued, give me credit for a little self-interest. I don't want seppuku in my backyard any more than you do. I'm just as vulnerable as everyone else.
How vulnerable is that? How vulnerable is that? Lubin wondered. Taka?
I don't know, Willette whispered. I don't know anything.
Guess.
She closed her eyes. It's a whole different bug than Behemoth, but it's designed. I think it's designed for the same niche. So being tweaked against Behemoth won't save you, but it might buy you some time.
How much?
I can't even guess. But everyone else, you know, I'd guess more than most anyone who hasn't got the retrofits. Symptoms after 3 or 4 days. Death within 14.
Dead slow, Lubin remarked. Any decent necrotizing strep would kill you in 3 hours.
Yes, before you had a chance to spread it.
Willette's voice was hollow.
They're smarter than that.
Mortality rate?
The doctor shook her head.
It's designed, Ken. There's no natural immunity.
The muscles tightened around Lubin's mouth. It actually gets worse, Desjardins added. I'm not the only watchdog on this beat. There are still a few others in Enum and a lot more overseas. And I've got to tell you, my limited containment strategy is not all that popular. There are people who'd just as soon nuke the whole bloody seaboard just to be on the safe side.
Why don't they nuke whoever's launching seppuku? Lubin wondered.
Try getting a fix on half a dozen submerged platforms moving around the deep Atlantic at 60 knots. Truth be told, some thought it was you guys.
It's not.
Doesn't matter. People are itching to go nuclear on this. I've only been able to hold them off because I could keep seppuku from spreading without resorting to fissa. Sorry. I've only been able to hold them off because I could keep seppuku from spreading without resorting to fissiles. But now, R's and K's, you've handed the nuclear lobby everything they need. If I were you, I'd start digging fallout shelters. Deep ones.
No. Clark shook her head. There were only, 6 people with wheels? Only 3 showed up, Willette said. But they could be anywhere. They didn't leave me an itinerary. And they'll be spreading the stuff. They'll be seeding it in ponds and fields and...
If we can catch up with them, we can backtrack, Lubin pointed out.
But we don't even know where they were headed. How can we...
I don't know how. The botfly wiggled on its ground effectors, a tiny flourish. But you better get started. You have made one industrial strength tar pit of a mess here, folks. And if you want to stand even a 1 in 50 chance of keeping this place from melting down to radioactive glass, you are damn well gonna help clean it up.
There was a silence. Stubborn flames crackled and spat faintly in the distance. "We're going to help you," Lubin said at last.
Well, you can all do your bit, of course, Desjardins replied, but it's your efforts in particular, Ken, that are going to come in most handy right now.
Lubin pursed his lips. "Thanks, but I'll pass. I wouldn't do you much good." Clark bit her tongue.
He's got to be working some kind of angle.
The botfly hovered for a moment, as if considering.
I haven't forgotten your skill set, Ken. I've experienced it firsthand.
I haven't forgotten yours, either. You could mobilize the whole hemisphere in 30 seconds flat.
A lot's changed since you retired, friend. And in case you haven't noticed, there's not much left of the hemisphere, even if I did have all my superpowers.
Willette's eyes flickered between man and machine, watching the point-counterpoint with a mixture of outrage and confusion. But at least she, too, seemed to know enough to keep her mouth shut. Lubin glanced around at the charred and darkling landscape. "Your resources seem more than sufficient. You don't need me."
You're not listening, Ken. A lot has changed. A lifter or two is nothing. It's background noise. But you start mobilizing too many resources at once, the wrong kind of people pay attention. And not everybody on this side is on this side, if you know what I mean.
He's talking about other lawbreakers, Clark realized. Maybe it's Spartacus versus the Trip. Or maybe all of them are off the leash by now.
"You'd rather keep a low profile," Lubin surmised.
I've always preferred subtlety. And your rather blunt social skills notwithstanding, when it comes right down to it, even you're more subtle than a fleet of fire-breathing killer blimps.
When it comes down to war, he means. Private war of the psychos by invitation only.
Clark wondered how many sides there were. Could they even have sides? How do you form an alliance with someone you know will stab you in the back the first chance they get?
Maybe it's just every sociopath for himself, she mused.
Then again, it wasn't Lubin who'd had difficulty choosing sides recently. "I'm otherwise engaged," Lubin said.
Naturally. You'd have to have a damn good reason to come all the way back here. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge isn't exactly in the neighborhood.
"It might be before too long, judging by the recent traffic."
Ah, somebody pay you a visit?
"Not yet, but they're sniffing around close by. It's an unlikely coincidence."
Don't look at me, Ken. If I'd spilled the beans, they wouldn't have to sniff around.
"I'm aware of that."
Still, you naturally want to know who's on the trail. Ken, I'm hurt. Why didn't you come to me at... Oh, right. You thought I was dead.
Desjardins paused, then added,
You're really lucky I came along.
"I'm even luckier," Lubin said, "that you need my help." The botfly bobbled in a sudden gust of hot wind.
Okay, then. You help you help me keep Enum from dying a little while longer, and I'll try and find out who's stalking you. Deal?
Lubin considered. "Seems fair," he said. Hey, Linguistician2 on Twitch.com. I want to offer promotion of your channel viewer followers views chatbots. Yeah, sure thing, buddy. Now, if you were a real humanoid, maybe we could get meaty. But you're fake, you're not real. Nothing about you is real. You're an artifice at best. You're not even wildlife on the maelstrom. Get the hell out of here.
Don't make me look up where your IP address comes from, Buster Brown. I'll IP ban you.
I don't actually think you can do that on Twitch. I should find out. It'd be nice. Don't shill your crappy ads at me, Buster Brown. If I wanted bots, I'd talk to myself. Wait, I already do that. Shit. Not the most horrifying laugh I've had, but not a good one either. Crash. The crusade, thought Lenny Clark, could go on without her. It wasn't as though it needed her services. Saving lives and ending them were the only two causes worth pursuing now, and she had no great skill in either. Of course, that wasn't exactly true, she realized, even as the thought occurred. When it came to total kills, there wasn't a person on the planet who could match her score. But those deaths had been indiscriminate and untargeted, faceless collateral she'd barely spared a thought for. Right now, the greater good needed something considerably more precise. Specific individuals, not whole populations. Isolated faces to be hunted down and, what was the word Rowan had used? Decirculated. It didn't have to be a euphemism. There'd be no reason to kill the vectors once they'd been found, even assuming that Seppuku hadn't killed them first. There were only 3 of them after all, and with less than a day's head start in a place where people were no longer a major part of the landscape. It was quite possible they'd be found before they could infect too many others, before uneconomies of scale made wholesale extermination the only viable option. 10,000 carriers might have to be burned for want of facilities to contain them. But 10 could be taken alive, isolated and cared for, their conditions studied in hopes of finding a cure. There'd be no need for outright murder. I'm not the one with the compulsive murder fetish, Ken. Either way, it didn't matter. Soon, Lubin would be on the hunt, backed up by all the resources Desjardins could provide, and whether he was in it for the kill or the thrill of the chase, Clark's presence at his side would only slow him down. Taka Willette had already gone on to better things, whisked away to a CSIRA facility where, as Desjardins had put it, your skill set can be much better utilized. She had left with barely another word or a glance at Lenny Clark. Now she was probably sitting at the end of a line that would start with Lubin, waiting to process the people he tracked down. There was no point along that short route where Lenny Clark could be useful. She couldn't save, she couldn't kill. Here, though, in the broken shells of Freeport, she could do something in between. She could delay. She could hold the fort. She could keep people from dying of tumors or broken bones, so that Behemoth and Seppuku could take a crack at them instead. Oh, I'm getting a phone call. One sec. Sorry about that. Let me just check ahead, see where this chapter ends. I may have to end a little early. Gotta help someone. Minor rescue. Oh no, we should be fine. Where did we stop at? So that Behemoth and Seppuku could take a crack at them instead. Let's try that paragraph from the top here. She couldn't save and she couldn't kill. Here, though, in the broken shells of Freeport, she could do something in between. She could delay. She could hold the fort. She could keep people from dying of tumors or broken bones, so that Behemoth and Seppuku could take a crack at them instead. Lubin did her one last favor before leaving. He navigated through the virtual lightscape of Miri's neural cortex, found the infestation that had betrayed them, and isolated it. It was too insidious, too deeply dug in to trust to mere deletion. There were too many places it could be hiding, too many ways to subvert the search protocols. The only way to be sure it was gone was to physically throw out the memory with the monster. Crouched over the dashboard, Lubin read reams of diagnostic arcana and called instructions over his shoulder. Behind him, Clark, up to her elbows in crystals and circuitry, did the actual cutting. Lubin told her which card to extract. She did so. He told her which array to peel from its surface, using a tri-pronged tool with delicate, whisker-thin fingers. She obeyed. She waited while he ran checks and double checks on the rest of the system, reseated the lobotomized unit at his command, poised herself to yank it again should any remnant of the monster have somehow escaped containment. Satisfied at last that Miri was clean, Lubin told Clark to lock and reboot. She did it without question. He never told her outright to destroy the infected component. That was just too obvious a measure to mention. It was, after all, a part of her. She didn't know how exactly. The perverse logic that had spawned and twisted these electronic demons was something better left to hackers and evolutionary ecologists. But back at the beginning, she'd been the template. She'd been the template. There we go. This thing had taken its lead from her. It was a reflection, however perverse, of Lenie Clark. And irrational though it seemed, she couldn't shake the sense that it still owed something of itself to the flesh and blood it was modeled after. She had raged and hated for so very long. Perhaps these reflections weren't so distorted after all. She resolved to find out. She was no codemeister. She knew nothing about growing programs or pruning software to specs. She did, however, know how to snap prefab components together, and Fusina's lockers and glove compartments were overflowing with the legacy of 5 years' service. The little sub had carried 1,000 survey instruments to Impossible Lake, served in the repair and maintenance of them all. It had slipped across thermoclines and through Langmuir cells, seeding drogues and TDRs into the water column. It had spied on corpses and moved supplies and served as a general workhorse far beyond anything its designers had ever intended. After 5 years, it had accumulated more than enough building blocks for Lenie Clark to play with. She found a Cohen board in the bottom of a drawer, plugged a battery onto one of its sockets and a generic OS chip into another. A tracery of filaments flickered briefly between the new components as the board's auto-discovery routines sniffed them out and made introductions. She had to look a little harder for the user interface. For a user interface. She couldn't risk a wireless hookup. Finally, she found an old fiber-op headset with an integrated infrared keyboard and plugged it in. More flickering handshakes. She slid on the headset. A pastel keyboard hovered in the air before her. She reached out. The headset's infrared eyes watched her hands move in empty space, mapped real fingers onto illusory controls. She brought up a map of the Cohen board, built a fence around a handful of empty sockets, cut a single gateway, and locked it tight from the outside. She assigned a panic button just in case. It floated off to one side, an orange spark in virtual space. There would be no need to reach out and touch it. Merely focusing her eyes on that icon would freeze the system solid. But the safeguard had a price attached. The headset couldn't see through photocollagen. Her eyes would have to be stripped naked during the encounter. She doffed the headset and regarded her handiwork in the real world. Two minuscule platonic solids and a thread of fiber op rising from a dimpled grid of empty pinhead sockets. A sparse right-angle spiderweb of emerald threads connected the plug-ins. Beside it, a glowing crimson border enclosed a rectangular patch of unoccupied terrain. It was completely self-contained and utterly isolated. There were no antennae, no wireless interfaces, nothing that could send a signal from that landscape to any other. Nothing plugged into the board would be able to get off it. She studied the infected and excised lobe of Miri's brain, a Lilliputian necklace of OPMs and memory chips lying isolated and inert in the palm of her hand. For all Clark knew, there was nothing left inside. The memory was non-volatile, but who knew what damage had been inflicted during the exorcism? She remembered her challenge to Ken Lubin. How do you know I can't wake the fucker with a kiss? But she had no idea how to actually do that. She'd kept these components only because she could not throw them away, and because she hoped that if she spoke to the thing inside, it might speak back. She lifted the necklace with a pair of force feedback tweezers whose touch was as fine as eyelashes. She seated it into the center of the red zone. Green threads sprouted from the other components and converged just outside the gate and stopped. She donned the headset. She took a breath. She opened the gate. No worries, Warren. No worries. Take your time. Glad you're tuning in at all. You could just watch them after the fact. No one would hold it against you. An explosion of pixels right in front of her. Anger and ravenous hunger and bared teeth, furious input that bypassed the upper brain entirely and plunged icy needles right into the brainstem. The flight response took over before she'd even parsed what she'd seen. The orange panic button flared in her sights. The image froze. She realized she was gasping. She forced herself to calm down. A motionless face, black and green and radiant. A furious portrait of inverted flesh tones. It didn't look like her at all. Except for the eyes, those empty, raging eyes. And not even those, she remembered after a moment, because her eyes were uncapped now. She faced this radioactive doppelganger completely naked. Is this what I was? She took a breath, held it briefly, let it out. She focused on the panic button and released it. "Me out!" the apparition screamed. Clark shook her head. "There's nowhere for you to go."
"Let me out or I'll grind every fucking address in here to pulp."
"Answer some questions first."
"Answer this, you worm-riddled twat."
The universe flickered and went out. Nothing but her own rapid breathing and the quiet hiss of Facina's air conditioner. After a moment, her headset etched a message across the void. System crash. Restart. YN. Clark tried again.
"Let me out!"
She shook her head. "Tell me what you want."
"What do you want?"
The question seemed to calm the monster down a bit. It even smiled.
"You don't want to fuck with me, friend. I've killed more people than you can count."
"Why? Revenge? For the GA? For Daddy? For what he did while Mom was... How could you care about that? How could you even know?" The face desaturated, its black light pigments fading as if in twilight. In moments it was blacks and grays and two angry, crystalline ovals of pure white. Are you trying to kill yourself? Are you trying to kill everyone? Clark asked softly. Are you trying to kill yourself? It glared at her and spat. Kill yourself? You dark and void and system crash. And the next time and the next. The skill of the chase. Axira my glottis was just like, nope, you're not doing that. Axira drone, floating like floating. Okay, let's try this for a third time. I'm sorry, sometimes it gets like this. Axira drone, floating like thistledown just below the jet stream, caught the heat trace at 0300. It was warming Service Road 23 northeast of Skowhagen. Hegan. It should be Hegan. It is misspelled. Boo. Unless there is a Skowhagen that I'm not aware of. And it was warming Service Road 23 northeast of Skowhagen, and it shared certain characteristics with another source, 2 hours older, that had been glimpsed by a lifter shipping medical supplies out of Portland. Resupply halls weren't normally charged with surveillance, but everyone was on alert since the word had come down from Sudbury. Both signatures matched the emissions put out by a brand of hydrogen cell that hadn't been manufactured since 2044. Someone was driving the shit out of an old Ford Fugitive, traveling inland along back roads in the middle of the night. One of Willette's Vectors had driven a fugitive. Lubin caught up with her somewhere on the far side of the New Hampshire border. Desjardins had requisitioned him an ultralight. It wasn't as fast as a ground effect transport, but its cruising altitude was a lot higher, and it drank fewer joules than a chopper. Lubin was flying west at about 200 meters when the Ford bounced sunlight into his eyes. Into his eyes, singular. Sorry. It was parked on the edge of an acid-washed bog full of rusty tannins and jagged, waterlogged stumps. The wetland seemed to have grown since highway maintenance had given up on the neighborhood. A tongue of dark water lapped across a few meters of low-lying asphalt just ahead of the vehicle. That wasn't what had stopped it, though. Lubin landed 50 meters up the road and approached from behind. His inlays performed the usual schematic vivisection as he drew near, cluttered up his vision with icons and wiring diagrams. His gut rebelled at the mere thought of tuning out usable intel from any source, but sometimes it distracted more than it informed. He shut down the display in his head. The fugitive dropped back into the real world, seemed to flatten somehow, luminous guts vanishing behind dirty plastic skin. A blonde mocha woman sat in the driver's seat, forehead against the wheel, long straight hair obscuring her face. She seemed oblivious to his approach. He tapped on the window. She turned apathetically at the sound. He knew immediately that something was wrong. Her face was flushed and shiny with perspiration. She knew something was wrong, too. Lubin's isolation skin would have pretty much given that away, even if she hadn't been sick. 3 days, he thought. The door was unlocked. He pulled it open and stepped back.
They told us it was a cure,
she said. It took her 2 breaths. Do you have any left? Lubin asked. She gulped.
Some. Spread most of it around.
She shook her head.
Gave some to Aaron, too, a couple of days ago.
A transparent bladder lay on the seat beside her. It had been drained almost flat. The culture that remained, sucked into creases and wrinkles in the deflated bag, was no longer amber in color. It was dark and gray as anoxic mud. "What happened to it?" he asked.
I don't know. Changed.
She shook her head tiredly.
She said it would last a week.
He leaned forward. She still had the presence of mind to look vaguely startled when she saw him up close.
You were one of them. You were one of them. I saw you there.
"I need to know where you seeded it," he said. "I need to know everyone you've been in contact with since Freeport, and how to get in touch with them." She held up one limp-wristed arm, showing off her wristwatch.
Aaron's in here. We split up. Thought we'd cover more ground.
He took the watch. Its phone feature wasn't much use without the earbud, but he could deal with Aaron later.
I was talking to him just this morning, the woman managed. He's not doing so well himself.
He circled the fugitive and climbed in the passenger's side. Nav was offline, a precaution left over from the previous week when the enemy had been when the ether had been when the ether had been enemy territory. I don't know why I'm having trouble right now. He brought up dashboard GPS and scaled the map to include the coast. "Everywhere you stopped," he said. "Everyone you met."
I'm sick,
She sighed. "I can get you to a hospital. A real hospital," he promised, sweetening the pot. "But you have to help me first." She told him what she could. Finally, he climbed back into sunshine and headed for the ultralight. Halfway there, he paused and looked back. She could make a run for it, he thought. She's not too sick to drive. She could try to escape. Or, eyeing the stained water by the bog, she could just lurch into the water and infect the whole bog. Much more difficult to contain after that. Maybe she's a loose end. Idle musing, of course. There was no immediate threat here, nothing to justify extreme prejudice. Not that that was always likely to be the case, the way this thing was spreading. This was the second vector Lubin had tracked down, and the first of Willette's original trio. The other had been a secondary who'd picked up the baton in her wake, and he'd admitted to seeding still others. How far the other two patient zeros had run was still anyone's guess. And now there was Aaron to deal with. Not to mention the half-dozen places where this woman had dribbled little aliquots of seppuku in her wake. There it is, the A word. You know it's a Watts novel. It is officially a novel by Peter Watts because he dropped the aliquot bomb. Sorry, he loves the word, or he uses it with frequency. He could afford to wait, he told himself. The way things were going, he'd have all the excuse he needed before long. Not that he needed excuses anymore, of course. Ken Lubin had been a free agent for years. Play nice, he told himself. Play by the rules. He did. He called the ambulance before he called the flamethrowers, stood guard until it floated in from the west, sprayed himself down, and climbed back into the sky. He banked southeast, backtracking the vector's route. A lifter appeared in the middle distance and paced him for a while, cruising like a great dark cloud toward the target areas he'd pinpointed. Pilot lights sparkled faintly at the tips of the long, incendiary muzzles hanging from its underbelly. Puffy pink and green clouds erupted intermittently from the air in the airspace beneath it, cotton candy litmus tests sniffing out infection. He edged up the throttle. By now, Aaron's partner would be bagged and on her way. Taco Willette would be running tests on her by nightfall. If Willette was running tests on anything, of course. Lubin had his doubts. He remembered the first time he had met Achilles Desjardins. He had broken into the lawbreaker's home and caught him in flagrante delicto with a VR sensorium that served up wraparound scenarios of sexual torture.
Desjardins would have never inflicted those impulses on the real world back then, of course, but a lot of things had changed in the meantime. Rules had changed. Leashes had been slipped. Official hierarchies had crumbled, leaving those who wielded power miraculously free of oversight. Lubin had eavesdropped briefly on Desjardins' fantasy life before getting down to business. He'd gained some idea of that man's taste in women, as well as what he liked to do to them. And so, 5 years later, when Taco Willette had climbed into the belly of a CSIRA helicopter, Lubin had watched with a dispassionate sense of futility. Finality, sorry. Finality. A dispassionate sense of finality. Dispassionate sense of finality. I don't know why that's so hard to say. It shouldn't be. It's barely alliterative. Desjardins had promised her a role in the fight against Seppuku. He had evoked visions of bright, gleaming laboratories normally reserved for bona fide meats arts. The prospect had lit her up like a halogen flood lamp. One look, and Lubin had known her secret desire, the desperate, unimagined hope of redemption for some past sin. By now, it was easy to recognize. He had been interested in whether the aircraft would head southwest toward Boston. That was where the nearest research facilities would be. But instead it had disappeared to the north, and Lubin had not heard from Willette in the days since. Not that he could have expected to, of course, even if Desjardins had been telling the truth. And Lubin had to admit, with the logical clarity of an amoral mind, that it didn't make much difference either way. Taco Willette was not the caliber of scientist who'd last in the ring against any kind of heavyweight opponent. If she had been, they wouldn't have found her relegated to wildland patrol, handing out crumbs to the ferals. Her loss would not matter at all in the fight against Seppuku. Achilles Desjardins, on the other hand, was vital. Whether he was also a sexual predator was irrelevant. He might well be instrumental in the saving of billions. Lubin couldn't think of many depravities that could not be overlooked in the pursuit of that higher goal. It was what the greater good was all about. He almost felt envious. And with that, we are going to call it. We will get cracking again next Friday, as per the norm, as per our regular schedule. And yeah. Geez, we're gonna have this sucker banged out in no time flat. And the last stream of it is gonna be pretty short, I would say. Come on, get your separators out of here, boy. Yeah, get your separator out of here. Wow, that is a long chapter. Golly gee willikers. Yeah, okay. Maybe not. Maybe it'll be the other way around. Shoot. How long is that chapter? Frick. Jeez, that thing's like 20 pages long. Anyway, hope people are digging it. I do have to get rolling. Let's find where I put my bookmark and plop it on in there. Plop it on in there, law. No, not that far along. There we go. That's better. Do 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 do. All right, yeah. Hope people are digging it. The next one's gonna start with some grade A unpleasantness. Really unpleasant. I'm going to have to put the warning up because yowza! You thought Desjardins was bad up until now. Damn! He can be worse. So much worse.
At any rate, grimness and people being awful to each other aside, hope people are digging it. So the continued long-term game plan at this stage is wrap up this last book in the Rifters trilogy, which is looking like it'll be 3 more streams or so, which would put us probably second week of October, at which point we'll get started doing the short story collection, not all of them that short, uh, the story collection, there we go, by Gregg Egan called Oceanic. Um, we've read the first short story in there, which was title of which I can't remember off the top of my head. We did that kind of as a little taster when I was about to go on a trip halfway across the country, and I didn't want to start Behemoth Book 2 and then wait 2 weeks or 2 streams. So we did that. I don't remember the name of that one. That'll bug me. Anyway, so we'll do that, and then that should put us pretty well set for just before the end of the year. We'll get started on Hyperion by Dan Simmons, which I took the time to do a reread of over the summer. It's going to be interesting. It's going to be fun. I have yet to decide whether I'm going to do both books in the Hyperion duology, in the Hyperion cantos. They are Hyperion and The Fall of Hyperion. I am probably going to do both tentatively because it picks up immediately. The second one picks up immediately afterwards, although it's a bit of a. We get introduced to a sort of new character who's going to be our perspective character for about half the book of the second book, and things are going to. Pacing is going to change somewhat for the second volume. We'll see. Eventually, I'll get around to Endymion. I remembered what that other request was. It was the Jesus incident. Or was it the Lazarus effect? It was either the Jesus incident or the Lazarus effect by Frank Herbert. And in order to get around to that, I'm going to have to read Destination Void first, because those are sequels to that. So yes, I will get around to that. After I do Hyperion, I'm going to do the first volume in the Three Body Problem trilogy, which is called The Three Body Problem, appropriately enough. And then I will probably do Destination Void at that point. Alrighty. So with that, that's our long-term plan, and that's gonna, like, Hyperion is gonna take a while. That's gonna be months. That's gonna be months, because that's, I don't know, it's like a better part of 1,000 pages. It's like 800 pages or so. It's pretty hefty. It's pretty hefty. Anyway, we will get to that. I do want to fit some more CJ Sherry in at some point in the next year. We'll see how that goes, and where I can do that. I also want to do some Ian M. Banks because he's worth it. He is that good. Where to start with that is anybody's guess. Probably I'd do it basically chronologically, although Consider Phlebas is not my favorite of the series. The first 3 novels I really came to appreciate, of the Culture series, I should say. The first 3 novels of the Culture series I didn't appreciate as much the first time through, but the second time I read them, I was like, oh yeah, no, you kind of have to read these. Because they really do give a strong insight on what the culture is all about, although it's largely through reflection. And that's kind of what makes particularly the first 2, Consider Phlebas and The Player of Games, kind of remarkable, is that they really don't focus on life and the culture all that much and what the culture is all about. They kind of are reflections thereof, and you figure out what the culture is like kind of by looking at the blank spaces, by seeing what they're not doing. Although the Player of Games is pretty explicit, and it's like, okay, here's kind of a meta overview of what they're going to generally behave like in certain situations. And then you have the third book, which is maybe my favorite of the series, The Use of Weapons. Uh, and that one is that one's a doozy. That one's great. Between that and basically every novel after The Player of Games is like an absolute banger. They're all bangers after that, in my opinion. Even the ones that are kind of slow. They were just like, wow, this is really good. Even the ones that don't seem like they have much to do with the culture, they're all bangers. He had quite some vision, that guy. Also, I want to get around to some David Brin. Um, I'm a sucker for Bryn, but this is all long term. Anyway, I got to run. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. If you didn't tune in and you're listening to this after the fact, I do these live every Friday on Free Read Fridays, where I read short stories and entire novels aloud. I start at about 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. Eastern Time, whatever it is. Shifts after the solstice, whatever. I'll try and give warning when that's going to happen, so people who don't have to deal with that crap, setting the clocks forward or back, will be able to tune in more readily. Anyway, that's it for me, guys and goyettes. And I'll see you all later. Thanks again. Stay safe, stay sane. Stay toasty or cool as per your preference. Stay dry or wet as per your preference. Speaking of which, I've got to do some minor hurricane prep because good old Lee swinging on up the coast, and it's not going to be bad, but power outages are probably in the offing, so I need to be slightly prepared. Alrighty, with that, I'm going to dip. Thanks again. See y'all later. Be decent to each other. That's the one. There we go. Don't be Achilles Desjardins. Holy shit, don't be like Achilles Desjardins. Be decent to each other. Don't be like him. Alrighty. Anyway,